Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and folks, and all the people who are watching. Uh, as I record this video, it's a chilly evening, and I've set the mood here with a nice little vanilla gingerbread, I think, candle. So sit back and relax, and be prepared to learn. All right, so this is the last lecture that's part of our kind of study of the modern, the making of the modern world, and it kind of goes with the sequence on capitalism and slavery and the Industrial Revolution. And so this is about more specifically about some of the history of colonialism and its impact on our world. So there's different ways that you could analyze it, that you could break it down, but I'm going to be talking about it in three phases. One, the spice trade, along with gold and silver and sugar. Two, the slave trade, cotton and early industrial capitalism. And three, the scramble for Africa and mature industrial capitalism. So this is a pretty brief overview. So I make no claims that this is a complete review of all of this. So starting with the spice trade, gold and silver and sugar, you may remember from the lecture on capitalism and slavery, we were talking about how before the modern iteration of capitalism, you had mercantile capitalism where wealthy merchants would trade for spices and silks and porcelains, and they would try to buy those in relatively cheap markets and sell them in more expensive markets, and that's how they would make their profit. And two of the largest trading conglomerates, I guess you could say, would be the VOC, otherwise known as the Dutch East India Company, and the British East India Company. In both cases, these trading organizations were sanctioned by the powers that be, the monarchy, and they were given the power to wage war. They were given the power to set up trading posts and sort of colonies, mini colonies, I guess. There would be, in theory, some oversight of these companies, but in practice, communication was really quite slow. So these companies were fairly free to, for example, wage war whenever they felt that it was necessary or that it would help their cause. I'll post a video on the VOC. It's this one that you see here, this YouTube address, that kind of goes over the history of it. These were also two of the, I think the very first two companies to actually offer stock in the companies. So initially, they were financed by people who were already quite wealthy, and that, it only went so far. They figured that a better way to do it would be to sort of open it up and allow more people to invest in it. Also, that reduced the risk because about 1 in 10 of the ships would not come back from any given trading mission. Not to mention probably dozens of sailors, if not more. And so if you owned a ship and that ship sank, you were out quite a bit of you're out your whole investment basically. Now, if however you owned 1/10 of 10 ships and one of those ships went down, you only lost 10% of your investment, and the other ships would of course return and be able to make a profit. So it made more sense to kind of break up the interest in these ships, right, and divide it among many people. So I believe the VOC was the very first to do that. And they created a sort of a trading house in Amsterdam, I believe. So, so that was sort of the foundation of kind of the modern, you know, stock industry. And the British East India Company is, of course, known in part for their colonization of India. And, they started with sort of trading posts, forts that were set up along the coasts. And there was a more powerful empire within India, the Mughal Empire. But little by little, they started sort of taking more territory. And, eventually they had colonized, the majority of the Indian subcontinent. And that was really before the Queen even really took it over. So India was actually not exactly colonized by Britain per se. It was colonized by a company. And this is something that's some historians would refer to as war capitalism, because it wasn't really free trade, free market capitalism. It was capitalism at the on the other end of a barrel of a cannon. So these companies would wage war with one another, with other European countries, with local empires and kingdoms and revolts and whatnot. So just to kind of situate you on a map of the globe here, the Netherlands is up here, and so that's where the VOC was from. And obviously, here's the United Kingdom. And, they're on the Atlantic seaboard. And as I said before, during the time of the Silk Road, a lot of the kind of trading routes were overland. But that became less economically profitable because the Ottoman Empire controlled a large swath of territory in the Levant and the Middle East, and also North Africa. And the Venetians, from basically Venice in Italy, controlled a large portion of the trade in the Mediterranean as well. And so countries, further west along the Atlantic seaboard, it didn't make so much sense for them to participate that way, because they would have to buy from a middleman like the Venetians or the Ottomans. So they started looking for ways around, and the Portuguese were among the first, if not the first. I think they were the first to really do that. And so they would sail over not only to India, but to Indonesia and parts of Southeast Asia, and they would trade with Japan and with China. And as I mentioned before, the Europeans wanted more from China than China wanted from the Europeans. So there was a trade deficit, and the Chinese began demanding payment of that deficit in gold and silver. And so, originally, one of the things that European trading powers were after was gold and silver. So, from the Gold Coast of Africa and Western Africa, they would get gold. The stories of El Dorado and whatnot were because once Columbus had stumbled upon the Americas, and Europeans, like especially Spain and Portugal, started turning their attention that way, they were mostly interested in gold and resources, and not so much in having large portions of their population move there and colonize it in that sense, as opposed to those who came from England to North America, although they were after resources as well. So just to give you kind of a timeline and an extent of colonization. So starting first with Spain and Portugal, by 1515, these were the Spanish colonies in the Americas. Hispaniola, which is the island that has Haiti and the Dominican Republic. This was the first place that Christopher Columbus landed. You got Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, and also parts of the Yucatan, Central America, the northern coast of South America. Now, at the largest extent of the Spanish Empire, the territories in red were under the control of the Spanish. So obviously, all of what's now Spain and Majorca, Menorca, Ibiza, islands in the Mediterranean, a large portion of the Caribbean, even a large portion of what's now the United States, Louisiana territory, Mexico, the western side of South America. They had some ports, trading posts in Africa, Western Africa, the Philippines. So they controlled a pretty large empire by 1790. Portugal as well. So obviously Portugal had what's now Brazil, and some parts of other modern countries in South America. The Canary Islands, the Azores. They had territories within Africa. I believe this is Sierra Leone, probably. And they had ports along the coast of India. So Goa in southern India was a big Portuguese trading port. Fun fact: chicken vindaloo, one of my favorite dishes, is an Indian dish, but also influenced by Portuguese tastes with vinegar and so forth. And they controlled certain islands in Southeast Asia, so also quite large. I suppose before I move on to cotton, originally, as I said, this began with the spice trade and with getting gold to trade with China. So there were relationships. So Spain and Portugal, they might trade for certain things in Southeast Asia that then they could trade further to Japan or China, and those might be the things that they were really after, that they could sell for quite a profit among wealthier people in Europe. But then eventually, as I mentioned when we talked about sugar, the plantation system had begun in the Caribbean, and they started realizing they could make a profit off of that. But it was really the British that took that kind of plantation system and really made it into a profit machine. So the Spanish and the Portuguese were still hungrier for gold, and didn't quite realize the full potential for profit from growing sugar using slave labor, using free labor, and then making that into a final product and selling that throughout their colonies and at home. And that's something that the British really excelled at, if you can use that kind of terminology. So they really kind of moved first from that sort of merchant capitalist system into more of a capitalist system that was further reaching, that it impacted not only the wealthy merchants and the nobles, but eventually a larger portion of the population. Okay, so phase two, slave trade, cotton, early industrial capitalism. So as I mentioned, Great Britain, they had possessions not only on the mainland of North America, including what's now the United States and Canada. They also had interests in the Caribbean, along the Yucatan, near the Yucatan Peninsula. So Belize, for example, was a British colony. And and they actually used a lot of their territory in the Caribbean there for growing sugar. In North America, they were interested in lumber. They were interested in pelts and furs, and obviously there was more settlement by people from Great Britain in what's now North America. So these are the British West Indies. They had Turks and Caicos, the British Virgin Islands, Anguilla, Antigua, Montserrat, Guadalupe, and the Cayman Islands. And, they used a lot of this for their sugar industry. So the red outlines here are places that were part of the British Empire in 1765, and the green was the empire in 1914. So in 1765, they had kind of their largest amount of territory in North America, also in the Caribbean and Central America. And they also had some ports in Africa, and they had smaller parts of the Indian subcontinent and parts of Southeast Asia. But then by 1914, they had large territories within Africa, the whole of the Indian subcontinent, and what's now Pakistan as well, Australia. So it was quite a large and formidable empire. And these ones in black represent kind of all of the places that were at one time rather colonized by Great Britain. I think it was something like 25% of the globe. And during this time, cotton, as we said, started to become bigger than sugar, because again they had really started their kind of love affair with cotton during their colonization of India. There were Indian calicos and fine textiles that could be sold abroad and at home, but of course at home mostly for wealthy people. And then because of a series of events such as tariffs and import prohibitions on calicos from India, thanks to the woolen industry, the kind of native nascent cotton industry that tried to make knockoffs of Indian calicos had begun. And then, once they started planting cotton in some of their colonies and using slave labor to grow it, they could then sort of manufacture it into their final product at home. They could sell it at home for cheap because, now you have free labor, and you also have a greater demand because all of their colonies became markets for it. They could also trade cotton textiles for for enslaved peoples in Africa, and so the cycle continued like we showed before. And obviously in the United States that became and in Great Britain a huge impetus for industrialization. There was the cotton gin, there was the spinning jenny, and so it became more efficient, which means that the cost of production was lower, which means that they could make a greater profit as their market grew. And then in phase three, kind of the last major phase of colonization, you have the scramble for Africa, along with a more mature industrial capitalism, so it had moved beyond cotton. And so the something that sort of captures the psyche of European colonialism at this time is captured by The White Man's Burden, which was originally a poem written by Rudyard Kipling. At this point, the British and the French justified colonialism to themselves by essentially saying that they were that colonialism was necessary for the people that were colonized, that they were bringing civilization, that they were bringing peace, that they were bringing Christianity. And so they kind of took this bizarre moral high ground, and they called this, the white man's burden, which was a paternalistic view that, the natives, the people indigenous to the places that they colonized, were incapable of ruling themselves, and they needed European intervention in order to progress. The French called this the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission, spreading superior French language and culture and Roman Catholicism throughout the world. And this rather disturbing kind of cartoon called The White Man's Burden, if you look closely on the bottom, it says apologies to Rudyard Kipling. This, I believe, was printed, let me see, Article Publication Company of New York. This was printed in the United States. And at this time, the major colonial powers in Europe were sort of, and Rudyard Kipling actually, when he wrote this poem, was encouraging the United States to take up the white man's burden, to sort of follow in the footsteps of the Europeans and, become a civilizing power for progress. And so here you see Uncle Sam, and you've got John Bull representing Great Britain, and they're carrying their people like good fathers, the people that they colonized, over the boulders and rough terrain of oppression and ignorance and vice and brutality and superstition, trying to get to the pinnacle of civilization. And so these terrible caricatures here are supposed to represent colonies. India, China. Really, there wasn't a whole lot of China that was colonized, although they apparently had a stake in it. And Cuba here, the United States, when the U.S. went to war with Spain. At the end of that war, the United States took over Cuba for a time and the Philippines for a time. So that captures sort of the mentality of the era. Now, in 1884, there was a conference called the Berlin Conference, where all the major powers of Europe that were into colonization, they got together in a very civilized manner, and they decided how they were going to carve up Africa and who was going to get what, because they felt like, okay, well, maybe we'll get together and we'll talk about it so there's no conflict, there's no war, we can sort of decide amongst ourselves who's going to take what. And they literally just sat down and carved up a map and decided who was going to colonize what in Africa. After the Berlin Conference of 1884, this is how they carved up Africa. Obviously, you see the French had a large stake, the British had a large stake, and then there were smaller stakes held by Germany, Portugal, Spain, France, I already said France, Italy, and only a couple of places in Africa were not colonized. So Ethiopia, for example. I'm not sure what all is represented here in West Africa. I know that this is Ghana. And I think this is, oof, man, my geography is bad. Is it Côte d'Ivoire? Yes, it must be Côte d'Ivoire because it's French, Ivory Coast. Now, Belgium, which we'll talk about here in a second, this actually wasn't exactly owned by Belgium. It was owned by the King of Belgium, King Leopold. And there's a really interesting and sad book called Leopold's Ghost, which is about how King Leopold ended up with basically his own colony that the Belgian people themselves didn't really want, wouldn't really have gone for, but basically the Congo became under his control, and well, I'll talk about that in just a second. So let's compare. In 1880, so this was before the Berlin Conference, there were parts of Africa that were colonized, like the Ottoman Empire controlled a lot of North Africa and Egypt and parts of Sudan, I believe. France had Algeria, Senegal, one portion of Congo. Portugal had Angola and Mozambique. Britain had what they called at the time Cape Colony, which was part of what's now South Africa. But the European colonies were mostly on the coasts of Africa. They didn't go very deep inside, and the interior of Africa was not very well known by Europeans at the time. But that all changed very quickly, and King Leopold was among the first really to sort of finance exploration of what he wanted to carve out as his colony. Now, these other territories here are kingdoms and caliphates and so forth within Africa, indigenous kingdoms. And by 1913, here's how it was largely carved up, as we saw before. So that was at the height of the colonization of Africa. And I believe, some of the last colonies were relinquished or fought for their independence by the 1960s. There may have been one or two that lingered beyond that. Now, during this type of colonization, there were two main forms of colonial rule. One was indirect rule. So in places where they had a long history of state-level organization, the colonial powers figured it would be more efficient if they just sort of hacked into that structure that already existed and sort of bought off or threatened the sort of leadership that already existed to run their colonies for them. And then the other kind was direct rule in places that hadn't really had a state-type structure where they would place their own officials. The European colonizers would place their own officials. So the French did a lot of this. And they set up various outposts and rudimentary infrastructure to rule those. Now, this had dire consequences after colonialism. With indirect rule, obviously, if you are splitting a people up amongst themselves and they can't trust their leadership, that echoes for a long time afterwards. It sort of rewards and instills corruption. And the way that they divided up people, there were even structures that were meant to sort of divide and conquer that created kind of new ethnicities. So the conflict in Rwanda, for example, in the 1990s, it came to a head in the 1990s, was largely an effect of, I'm not sure if it was French or Belgian rule, where they had divided up the population essentially into pastoralists and farmers, and along pseudo-ethnic lines, the Hutus and the Tutsis, and because one was preferentially kind of given power and ruled over the other, after colonialism ended, there was a lot of deep-seated resentment and conflict there. So that's obviously one effect of colonialism. Colonialism impacted the economy, so it brought some places that did not have a pervasive capitalist system into kind of an international capitalist economy. we read about the TIV and how the introduction of general purpose currency throughout all economic spheres changed the way the economy was organized and the roles of men and women, and brought them into the international economy. It impacted the social structures because, if you sort of pull on one thread in the web of culture, you're going to impact everything else. And the slave trade had obviously taken a significant portion of disproportionate portion of males, and that caused demographic issues as well. It affected the political structures, right? So if you're doing indirect rule or you're doing direct rule, whichever way you do it, you're kind of impacting the type of organization that's internal and the loyalties that people have. It created new and somewhat arbitrary territorial divisions that lumped together, ethnic groups or kin groups that maybe had their own territories before. It impacted infrastructure, so it created infrastructure preferentially for administration of the colonies and for trade, and of course left some places without infrastructure. And it stoked violence and conflict. So if you remember that video on transatlantic slave trade and how the slave raids that were a consequence of the demand for slaves, and later on for kind of preemptive protection, they caused a lot of conflict between various kingdoms, and then there was sort of an arms race, and after the economy collapsed, they were left fighting amongst themselves. So we already talked about world systems theory, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but you recall that this is a way to look at socio-political relations based on wealth and power, and how this system transcends individual countries. And so here, during this colonial period and in the slave trade, there was kind of the creation of a core and a periphery. The periphery being the places where raw materials and cheap or free labor came from. And then the core was manufacturing those raw materials into something that was more valuable on the market and selling it not only within the core, but back to the periphery and the semi-periphery areas. And so that system tends to kind of perpetuate itself. And so there's still remnants of this today, obviously, in terms of places where there's more conflict, places that were economically set behind Europe and are still struggling to catch up. And one case study is Haiti. So this just shows, again, the volume of the slave trade and where most of the enslaved peoples were sent. So this is in the 17th century, so in the 1600s. You see a lot are going to Brazil and the Caribbean islands, a very few originally to Jamestown, mostly from West Africa. But there was also trans-Saharan type slave trade. There was Arabic traders were also involved in the slave trade in different directions, but the majority are coming from Western Africa, through the Spanish and the Portuguese, and then later the French and the British. By the 18th century or the 1700s, there were 7 million enslaved people that were taken from West Africa to the Caribbean alone. So Santo Domingo, again, is where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are. And then there were less that were sent to various places in South Africa. By the 19th century, the volume had reduced somewhat. Just under 2 million went to the Caribbean. Also, just under 2 million went to Brazil. And interestingly, this is not something that I think is emphasized a lot necessarily in U.S. history, or at least I hadn't remembered it. But the slave trade itself was abolished in the U.S. In 1807. It took effect on January 1st of 1808, but it was actually the slave trade itself was abolished by that time. It was also abolished in England in 1807. In Denmark, it had been abolished in 1792, and the latest among these was Portugal in 1830. Now, there was still clandestine slave trading that was going on in the U.S. The last ship didn't arrive until much later, but the institution of slavery, of course, was not abolished in the U.S. until after the Civil War. So it, at this time, cotton was still king in the South, and the North profited also from the manufacture of cotton textiles and other things, and depended on the South to produce. So it was quite entrenched until after the Civil War. So before the Haitian Revolution, Haiti was one of the richest islands in the French Empire in the 1700s. Haiti, which is small, it's really small. It produced 60% of all the coffee and 40% of all the sugar that was consumed in Europe in this one small half of an island. At the height, France brought up to 40,000 slaves per year to Haiti. And in a certain decade in the 1700s, that was over a third of the entire slave trade. So at any one time, there were over 800,000 slaves working to produce wealth that they didn't share in Haiti. And obviously, enslaved peoples were not, given the benefit of education. Infrastructure was, again, mainly for administration and for trade. Haiti began its revolution in 1791, led by Toussaint Louverture, and they won their independence from France in 1804. So this was the first really successful slave rebellion, and that obviously sent shockwaves through the colonial powers. However, this rebellion and the ensuing civil war destroyed a lot of what infrastructure there was. So they're left with a lot of damages, including damages to agricultural fields. And so they, in order to start their country and be independent, they kind of had a lot of repairing to do of infrastructure, of political structure. So, they were starting from not just scratch, but really even behind that. Because, in the United States, you had people who had been educated. They weren't really dealing so much with, at least initially, with, destroyed infrastructure and whatnot. They had good relations with various European powers. However, after the Haitian Revolution, France had the audacity to demand reparations, saying that the Haitians had cost them, obviously, to send the military, to wage war, and also in lost revenues from the productive fields. And so France imposed reparations of 150 million francs. And so this is a time where, Haiti, without kind of being plugged into the French Empire, they were sort of alone initially in the world and would have to make their way in the international capitalist system really to for their country to thrive. But they kind of were left with nothing. And on top of that, they had a huge debt. So they started out their country with a massive debt, and they were paying that off from 1825 until 1947. They were still paying this off, reparations for getting their independence from France. Now, to do that, they had to take out loans with exorbitant interest rates from American banks, German banks, French banks, and 80% of the national budget of Haiti was spent on loan repayments. So obviously, that's going to hugely hinder their economy. And for quite a while after the rebellion, various countries wanted nothing to do with them. The United States didn't really want to help out because no one who participated in the institution of slavery and benefited from it wanted to encourage slave rebellions, or to really acknowledge their existence as independent nations. This is a video that I'm going to post that kind of shows you the difference between Haiti today and the Dominican Republic today. So again, they're on the same island of Santo Domingo, and the Dominican Republic was a Spanish colony, and they weren't. It wasn't used in the same way or to the same extent as Haiti was by the French. It was ruled differently. There was more mixing of people, and Haiti was really just used. The land was overworked. The people were overworked. The people were kept poor, separate. So that has ramifications even today. And when the Dominican Republic became independent, they didn't have the same burden of debt and kind of a stigma in international relations that Haiti did. And even today, that has resulted in two vastly different countries on the same island. So that's an interesting video to check out. Another case study is the Congo. So this is King Leopold of Belgium, who kind of took it over as his personal colony because he thought, well, if I want to be a real monarch, I need a colony. Now, Belgium wasn't too keen on that, so he did it in a very sneaky kind of way. He convinced international powers that he wanted to send missionaries there and Christianize it, and and he wanted to help the people, and so he got support and funding from the international community, but with few people really monitoring the situation, he turned it into his own personal colony. And it was it was used for natural resources, including rubber. And if you've ever seen Blood Diamond, which is a good movie, but fairly brutal, now Blood Diamond didn't take place in the Congo. It took place in I think it was it Sierra Leone, or was it somewhere in South Africa? I'm not sure, but it wasn't the Congo. But they do show this practice of cutting off hands. So the colonial authorities would sometimes cut off people's hands if they hadn't produced their quota to sort of, basically it was terrorism, to sort of strike fear into the rest of the population and terrify them into working harder and working faster. And obviously, you see these are very young boys here. And so it was just run in the most brutal kind of way. And it's no wonder that the Congo is still sort of struggling, because if you can imagine all that division, disparate peoples thrown together in a colony, just treated terribly. Again, infrastructure not sort of evenly developed, the education system not really developed, and political instability. And today, one of the things going on in the Congo is mining for coltan. So that's what's going on here. Coltan is something that's used in technology, and so it's in your cell phones, it's in your computers, and it so happens that you can find a good portion of it in the Congo. And there's very little regulation of how that's mined. So there's child labor, there's communities like sort of makeshift communities that are set up that don't necessarily have any kind of security or like a law structure. There's prostitution, and just sort of there's no structure to look after the well-being of the people who are there. And so there's a video here that kind of exposes some of that and how it's part of the modern kind of international capitalist system. And obviously there are attempts to regulate conflict minerals, conflict diamonds, and so forth. But it's very difficult to do that when everything gets mixed together. And there are some kind of international interests who aren't super interested in policing that. In this video, you see representatives of Chinese companies who are buying coltan directly from markets in the Congo, and they're not really paying attention to where they come from or whether their child labor was used and so on and so forth. So you can see how this kind of world system perpetuates itself. It's a difficult cycle to break. It's not to say that it's impossible to break, but when you look around the world and you wonder why certain powers exist and certain countries are still struggling, you can trace a lot of it back to colonialism and the slave trade and everything that sort of came after that. A lot of the wealth of parts of Europe was built on this kind of thing, and a lot of the poverty in other parts of the world is largely the result of this kind of thing. So anyway, that wraps up all the topics that are going to be on this second exam. I will be posting more of a study guide coming up soon, and I'll be in touch with details. So as always, email me if you have any questions, and I will be in touch with you soon. All right, take care.